Hello, and welcome to the fifth webinar of our ArcGIS for Housing series, leveraging geospatial data in social housing to improve outcomes across your business. So we're having some issues sharing cameras today, so unfortunately you're just going to see slides and not our faces. But we have a great lineup of speakers for you, which I'm very excited about. So first, we'll hear from Annie, Policy Leader for the Quality of Existing Homes at National Housing Federation. Annie will talk to us about policy and regulation changes, which emphasises the importance of social landlords having good data about their homes and residents. Annie will talk about the work the National Housing Federation has been doing in supporting its members to improve their use of data, and some insights from housing associations who already use data effectively. We will then hear from Rachel, Esri UK's young scholar, who tackled the challenge of identifying homes and people most at risk of cold, mould and damp in her research, using Esri's geospatial platform and location data from a range of open source datasets. Finally, we'll be joined by Luke, GIS Manager at Asta Group, who will show us how GIS lets Asta bring together data from across their systems, including BIM data to aid their building safety team. But first, a quick few housekeeping notes from me. So the webinar is being recorded and a link will be shared in the follow-up email, which will also include any links mentioned in the webinar by any of the speakers. We're not going to have a Q&A, but we will have a Slido open for anyone to ask some questions. And you can access the Slido either by scanning the QR code on the screen or by entering the event code ESRI1510 on the Slido website, which is www.slido.com. So to kick off, I'm going to hand straight over to Annie. So Annie, do you want to take us away?
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, everyone. Yeah, apologies. You can't see my face and I don't have slides to share, so you'll just have to listen to me talk. So I'm Annie Owens. I'm Policy Leader at the National Housing Federation for the Quality of Existing Homes. The NHF represents housing associations across England, and I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years responding to changes from the government by the Regulator of Social Housing and other bodies about the quality of homes, but also about the data that social landlords hold about the quality of their homes and about their residents. So I guess I'm kicking us off and doing that by giving some context, some broader context on kind of why it's important for social landlords to have data, what regulation and policy and government changes focus on this, make it important, and just set the scene really before passing over to you two other great speakers who will give you a more technical insight into how data is used. So the importance of good quality data about the condition of homes and about the needs of residents is really being emphasised all across the political and regulatory landscape at the moment. You all know that high-profile tragic events, including the fire at Grenfell Tower and the death of Awab Ishak as a result of mould in his home, showed that some social landlords did not have a good enough understanding of the condition of their homes, or if they did, some weren't kind of fully recognising the risk to residents from condition issues, or they didn't act quickly enough to improve their homes where needed. As a result of this, over the last few years, there's been a big series of regulatory changes, policy changes, new legislation, all designed to improve the quality of homes across the sector. And a big part of that is ensuring that landlords have good enough data to evidence that their homes are good quality, that they're meeting their residents' needs, that they understand how well their services are being delivered. So I'm going to go and give a bit of an overview about some of these changes. The first one, really important one, is that we now have proactive consumer regulation by the Regulator of Social Housing. So this was brought in the Social Housing Regulation Act, which introduced a whole suite of changes about how the sector is regulated and emphasised in much more depth how much the regulator will be focusing on safety, on quality, on the experiences of residents, on how important it is for landlords to engage with and listen to their residents. So as part of this, the regulator is now assessing compliance against its safety and quality standards, and this states that registered providers to social landlords must have an accurate, up-to-date and evidenced understanding of the condition of their homes that reliably informs their provision of good quality, well-maintained and safe homes for tenants. So the regulator is saying that all social landlords must have good quality information about the condition of their homes, and the regulator will be assessing against that. The regulator of social housing also emphasises the importance of landlords holding robust information about their tenants, and using that information to ensure that repairs and maintenance services are tailored as needed to keep residents safe. So, as an example of this, social landlords should really be identifying, if they have a home that they know has some issues with damp and mold in it, they should be identifying whether there are any young children or elderly people, or perhaps people with asthma or other respiratory conditions, because all of these factors will make people more at risk to their health if they live in a home with damp and mold. And then the landlord should be using that information to determine how quickly they respond. So if they need to prioritise repairs. Regulators collecting more data directly from social landlords through the tenant satisfaction measures, which will be published by the regulator in the next couple of months. And I'd say it's really clear from organisations who've already been through the early rounds of inspections by the regulator under this new consumer regime that the regulator is really focused on assurance in the regulator's interviews. Directors and board members are being asked, how do you have assurance that you know your properties are in good condition? What data do you hold? What data is being reported to your board so that they have assurance that homes are in good condition and that the organisation knows the homes are in good condition. We've had a good few consumer inspection regulatory judgments come out now, and the common weakness that we can see in some of the organisations that aren't getting the highest grades are that they have old and incomplete information about the condition of their homes, whether that's through a stock condition survey or other sources. So the regulator is really saying you need to have good quality, recent data about the condition of your homes, and you need to use this information to inform how you're delivering services to make sure that your homes are in good condition and you're keeping your residents safe. Last year, the regulator looked specifically at how social landlords manage tackling damp and mould in their homes. It found that most social landlords do understand the extent of damp and mould in their tenants' homes and are taking action to address it, but they could strengthen their approach further. The regulator said that better performing landlords manage their data well, they have accurate and up-to-date information about tenants' homes, and they use it to find and resolve problems proactively. So the best examples I've come across are social landlords that will assess which of their homes are more prevalent to having damp and mold developing. That could be homes that are older, homes with poorer energy efficiency, could be homes with particular types of construction. And then they can use that to take proactive steps to prevent damp and mold developing. They might put in better ventilation, or they might take steps to make the homes more energy efficient so that they're kept warmer, so that it's less likely for damp to develop. And Rachel's going to talk in her presentation about how she's used GIS data to identify homes that are at greater risk of damp and mould. And as I was saying, this kind of predictive analysis is really useful. It helps landlords to take preventative steps. So alongside this consumer regulation from the regulator of social housing, we also now have a new regulatory regime focused on higher risk buildings. So focusing on making taller buildings of 18 metres above or 7 stories, keeping them safer, following on from the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower. And the key focus of the high risk regime is that people who manage these high risk buildings must have sufficient information about how the building is constructed in order to assess whether any remediation works are required to make the building safe. And people responsible for managing higher risk buildings must have a golden thread of information, which is a digital record of all the right information that they need in order to understand the building and the steps that they need to keep the building and the people living in it safe. This is a really significant shift in emphasis. We now have a building safety regulator who is actively gathering this information, checking that the people who manage these higher risk buildings have the information they need to understand the safety. And there's lots of tools and approaches for maintaining this information that have been developed. And Luke's going to talk later in his presentation about how he's using GIS data in BIM models to enhance ASTA's understanding of building safety. Another place that this focus on data is being emphasised from is the Housing Ombudsman. So they've emphasised how important it is to have good data and record keeping in their Spotlight report on knowledge and information management, and are finding your silence. So this focuses on landlords needing to have enough information to identify those homes that they haven't been into recently and those residents that they haven't heard from. and where that kind of lack of information actually is evidence of a problem or the chance of a problem. So the Housing Ombudsman is really emphasising that landlords need to have, again, good quality information about the condition of their homes, but about kind of how recently they've been in the homes, how recently they visited, how recently they've had contact with residents, because that is an indicator of risk of there being an issue in the home that you don't know about, or that your resident has a support need that you don't know about and that you need to address. So basically, from all across the sector, from the regulator of social housing, from the building safety regulator, from the housing ombudsman, there's this real focus on data, on good data about the condition of your homes and about the needs of your residents. And social landlords have taken good steps to improve in this space. And we at the National Housing Federation have been taking steps to support our members to improve the data that they hold and they use as well, given how important a topic it is. Back in 2022, before the new consumer regime from the regulator of social housing came into effect, we commissioned, jointly with the Chartered Institute of Housing, an independent review into quality in the sector. This was as a result of several high-profile cases being covered by ITN and other sources of residents just living in homes that were not in a good enough condition, where the social landlord really should have been kind of taking many more proactive steps to improve the condition of their home. So this independent report was the Better Social Housing Review. It was an independent panel. It was chaired by Helen Baker, who's the chair of Shelter. And this report came out in December 2022, just after the coroner's inquest into the death of our Bishak. And one of the key recommendations from this report was that social landlords can do more to improve how they collect and use data about the condition of their homes and the needs of their residents. It also had a focus on equity in social homes, because there's a lot of data that shows that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic residents are more likely to live in social homes that have issues like damp and mold than their white British counterparts. And this is linked to structural inequities in wider society. But we think that there's a clear role for social landlords to play in addressing this inequity amongst their residents as well. So in response to this report, the Better Social Housing Review, at the NHS, we've been delivering a programme of work called Knowing Our Homes, where the focus is really to develop resources and tools that will help social landlords to improve how they're using data, how they're collecting data and then using it. First stage was to develop our own understanding of how social landlords currently use data. We found that lots of landlords do have good data. They have stock condition surveys that through which they collect information about the condition of their homes on a regular basis. They also pull together information gathered through their day-to-day work on repairs and maintenance and their visits to tenants. But there are lots of social landlords as well who need to improve or have already begun improving how they're kind of gathering and using data. And we have two key outputs that are coming out through this Knowing Our Homes work. One, we're just about to publish a report Thursday this week that looks into making every contact count. This is an approach where social landlords can use every interaction they have with residents, so routine interactions, your repairs requests, home visits, whenever a resident rings up to report an issue or to ask for something. Each of those interactions is a chance for the social landlord to check in on the condition of their home, check in on the needs of the residents, and check that they have the information that they need to be assured that the homes are in good condition, the residents are getting the support that they need from their social landlord. A lot of this is about training up staff to know what to look out for. So lots of social landlords now are developing approaches where kind of all of their resident-focused staff will be trained up to recognise when homes have an issue that needs to be addressed. So they'll be trained to look at and identify the early signs of damp and mould and other property issues, and then they'll be able to report that somewhere else in the organisation so that there's an action taken to kind of improve the home, take any repairs that are needed. So that's very important. So we're publishing a report on this on Thursday. It's got a series of case studies, 11 case studies from social landlords across the sector. So do look out for that coming out later this week. And then the other key output that we are working on is we've launched a partnership with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors to develop a stock condition survey standard. The aim of this is that RICS will create a more standardized and consistent approach to understanding the condition of homes through a kind of standard stock condition survey. So really setting out what are the key pieces of information about the condition of the homes that social landlords can collect through these stock condition surveys on a kind of rolling, regular basis. Work on this is just beginning in earnest. We launched the work last month. We expect it will take at least a year to develop because it needs to be done in detail, done properly, and with lots of engagement across the sector and consultation as well. But we think the end result will be something that's really useful. So I guess just in summary, look, it's really important for social landlords to have good quality data about the condition of their homes. It's important not just because it's being pushed for by the regulator and the housing ombudsman and government as well through regulation, but because this good quality data means that social landlords have a good understanding of the condition of their homes and they can have the assurance that they know or will know when there's something in their homes that they need to fix to keep their residents safe. So with that, I'll hand back to Isabel, and then you can hear some specific examples of using data in social landlords.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Annie. And it's great to hear how important that you see data in the social housing space, because I definitely see that mirrored in the industry and when I talk to my customers. And at Esri, we see GIS as a way to make sense of all that data, so both visually, but also to make sure key connections are identified and acted upon. And in many cases, it's only the location that can link different data points together, especially in an industry as location focused as housing. So next I'm going to pass to Rachel to show us her research. So Rachel has used that wealth of data to available to housing providers and use location through GIS to identify risk and gain insight, helping to solve some really pressing issues for all providers. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Izzy. So, as Annie has just introduced, the presence of mold, damp, and excessive cold in a home can have a huge impact on the health and the quality of life of that home's residents. The UK housing stock is particularly vulnerable to cold, mold, and damp, and this research project rose out of a desire to explore how geospatial data could have an impact improving housing conditions in the UK by identifying the properties most at risk in order to allow targeted interventions. Through this research project, I've developed a risk model to identify homes that are vulnerable to cold, mold, and damp, pulling together relevant data from a wide range of open source data sets, and I then produced an interactive web app for relevant policy and decision makers to utilize. But first, I'll talk a little bit about the factors that can influence a home's vulnerability to cold, mold, and damp. First up is insulation. Energy inefficient homes are harder to heat, and then in turn, colder homes are at a higher risk of developing mold and damp, partly due to the condensation that can build up inside a home when the walls, roofs, and floors are colder than the indoor temperature. In addition, poor levels of insulation can lead to water penetration, which can then cause penetrating damp. So insulation is a really important factor when addressing excessive cold, mold, and damp. And it's also really important to note here that poor quality or poorly installed cavity insulation can actually exacerbate mold issues. So it's really important that insulation is installed to a high quality and of a high standard. Next is ventilation. Insufficient ventilation can cause higher levels of humidity in a building, and homes with poor ventilation have been shown to be associated with an increased risk of asthma exacerbation and respiratory tract infections. It's also really important to note that ventilation becomes particularly relevant alongside homes that are well insulated. Often, measures to improve a building's heat loss can result in a sealing action to minimize drafts and air leakages, but this can increase humidity levels and inadvertently increase mold growth if ventilation systems are not included as part of retrofit strategies. Next is building age. So amongst building related factors, there's been several studies that have suggested that building age is a key determinant of its vulnerability to damp and mold. And in addition to mold risk, indoor air temperatures tend to be warmer in newer buildings compared to older. And then income deprivation can really affect a resident's ability to heat their home sufficiently. There's been a lot of research showing that underheating a home due to cost is associated with a threefold increase in mold growth, and families living below the poverty threshold in England have been shown to be more likely to live in homes with damp and have higher risks of winter mortality and respiratory health conditions. And finally, overcrowding in a home can increase levels of moisture in that home, which can in turn increase the risk of damp and mold. So overcrowding is a really important factor in the risk of respiratory tract infections. In addition to the factors that influence a home's vulnerability to damp and mold, the study also considered vulnerable residential groups, so those that would be particularly impacted if exposed to cold, damp and mold in the home. Those with pre-existing respiratory conditions are more likely to experience the adverse health effects of living with cold and mold. And children and young people are particularly vulnerable due to their lungs still being in development, and they inhale a lot air on average compared to an adult. And older residents are particularly at risk and are 4 times more likely to develop asthma symptoms when living in a moldy environment. So all of these risk factors were taken together and the cold, mold and damp risk model was created. And the vulnerability was split into 3 categories. Firstly, the physical building attributes. So that's the things like the insulation, the ventilation and the age of the building. And then residential attributes, so levels of overcrowding and income deprivation. And then separately, a risk impact score was fed into the risk model of population vulnerability. So that's your elderly and young residents and those with existing respiratory conditions. This chart details the data that I gathered in order to represent each element of the risk model. Information related to insulation and ventilation was taken from energy performance certificates for the households in the study area. These are not available for every single household, although the vast majority of households did have this data available. But in order to supplement this data related to insulation, I also acquired high-resolution thermal imagery in order to get a further idea of how well insulated each individual building was. And then data related to the age of each building was taken from the Centre for Environmental Data Analysis. The rest of the data I was not able to obtain at the individual building level, so I obtained it for census output areas. So data related to overcrowding, income deprivation, the number of elderly and child residents, and data for pre-existing respiratory conditions was all taken from either the NHS or the census at the census output area level. And the data preparation for this analysis was undertaken in ArcGIS Pro. So the data for each individual building was georeferenced, and then I calculated a heat loss score for each individual building from the thermal imagery by using building footprint data to extract the average pixel values from the thermal image for each building. And I then joined this data together in ArcGIS Pro and calculated a score out of 1 for each building, for each factor of the risk model. And then to calculate the vulnerability at each neighbourhood level, I began by calculating the percentage of homes in each census output area that were either overcrowded, experiencing income deprivation, and the number of elderly and young residents in each area. And I then used the NHS data to calculate a statistical estimation of the percent of residents in each area with existing respiratory conditions. And I then joined this data also together in ArcGIS Pro and scored each census output area out of 1 for both the risk likelihood and the risk impact. In order to communicate the results of this study to an end user, I created an interactive web app in ArcGIS Online so that an end user can easily interact with the results. Because the data I utilised was at both the census zone level and the individual building level, I modelled the risks first at the census scale so that when you first open up the web app, you can identify neighbourhood areas that are most vulnerable to excessive cold, mold and damp. And then you can zoom into each area to identify the individual buildings most at risk within each neighbourhood. So interacting with individual buildings on the web app pulls up more information for each building, including that building's insulation type, its age, its ventilation, and its thermal heat loss. And there's also bespoke recommendations provided for each building as to any retrofit activities that could reduce its vulnerability to cold, mold, and damp. Homes that are not being heated sufficiently are at a really high risk. So in order to try to identify these in the risk model, if in the thermal imagery an individual building was leaking less heat than we would anticipate given its levels of insulation, a warning message appears on the web app stating that the home may be being underheated. And if a building has never had an EPC inspection or has not had one for over 10 years, a further warning message appears to suggest that a repeat inspection takes place. And the web app includes several filter options so that you can filter specifically to the homes that are at risk of underheating or those homes that are overdue an inspection. By considering as many indicators of cold, mold, and damp as possible and bringing in data from a wide range of sources, this risk model may provide a more meaningful indication of a building's vulnerability compared to looking, for example, at just traditional EPC ratings alone or just traditional thermal imagery alone. There are several ways that this research project could be developed and taken forward. Firstly, this model was built based on extensive reviews of academic literature as to specific indicators of cold, mold, and damp. However, as I didn't have access to confirmed instances of mold and damp in a home, it hasn't been tested on properties where mold and damp has been confirmed. So if anyone has access to this data, it would be really interesting to explore this. Also for data such as the overcrowding and the income deprivation and the presence of vulnerable groups, I used the data at the census area level as it was not publicly available at individual building level, but many of you may have access to data at this more precise level, so the model could be improved by incorporating more precise data. And finally, developments in thermal imagery mean that high-resolution satellite thermal imagery is now available across the UK, taken at regular time intervals. And this is something that would be perfect to feed into a model such as this, as it provides more regular insights into a home's thermal performance and thermal activity. So thank you so much for listening. A link to this work will be circulated after this webinar. So after reviewing that, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll pass it back now over to Izzy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Listening to your process and research is so interesting. And we know that cold, mould and damp are very prevalent issues in the UK. And with housing being such a location-based industry, seeing you use location in a way to link data to identify risk is really powerful. Thinking not just about the physical description of the property, but also the people living in the home and identifying those more in need of intervention too. So last but by no means least, I will pass to Luke. We have talked a lot about data and using location as a golden thread, linking various data sets together. And so now for the real world example of GIS at Astor Group. So over to you, Luke.
Hi everyone. I'm Luke. I'm a GIS manager at Astor Group, and I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction as to who Astor Group are, the infrastructure, the Esri infrastructure that we use, and then I'll talk about some of the ways we are making the most of automation, including with a few examples, and then I will talk about some of our BIM integration that we're doing. So, who are Astor? Well, we're a social housing provider that operates across the southwest of England. We've got general needs housing, shared ownership, housing for older people, the whole works. We build about 1,000 new homes a year. This is generally a mixture of general needs and shared ownership. In terms of our Esri infrastructure, we've been using Esri for a very long time. When I started, we were using ArcMap 931. We're now much more advanced, thankfully. So we're using ArcGIS Pro. We've got ArcGIS Enterprise 11.1, and a whole host of applications and portal things that go alongside that. So, making the most of automation. There are a few key tools that we use. So our enterprise geodatabase is one of the really important ones. This allows connections to other business systems, which are continually being updated and added to. So from this, we create models in Model Builder. This provides a quick method of building the tasks that we want to. It sort of provides us with a framework, and then we will take those models, export them to Python, where we'll refine the task, add some print statements, some error logging, that sort of thing, just to sort of refine it and make it a little bit more smooth. And if things do go wrong, we know what's gone wrong and where. Once we're happy with those Python scripts, we can schedule them to run through Task Scheduler. So this allows us to run those tasks at whatever intervals and whatever time of the day we choose. So some of them will run sort of nightly, sort of early hours of the morning. Some of them will run sort of at the weekends, and some of them will run monthly or quarterly, just depending on what it is and what it's doing. Finally, we have SQL Server Management Studio. This is where we can sort of get a bit creative with things. So often people just pull stuff out of there. We sort of push and pull, so we can do stuff in GIS, push that back to SQL, and then pull that end result back into GIS again. So I'm going to give a few examples. So hopefully that sort of brings this to life a bit. So this is an example of how we might load a corporate data set. So this is one that is constantly changing, updating. So it's our property table as an example. So the property table is held in our SQL Server database. This is where data from across the business is collated. We then give it the coordinates, and then our enterprise geodatabase allows us to connect to that table from within ArcGIS Pro. So we then use Model Builder to create the basic import process, which is what you can see on the left. And we then refine it in Python, which is what you can see on the right. So yeah, that's where we've got the print statements, some timings, some error logging, that sort of thing. And once we're happy that that's all running okay, we can schedule that in Task Scheduler. So my next example is how we push and pull data from our SQL database. So the problem I had was that we have a lot of T marks that we want to draw, but these are very time consuming if we want to do them perfectly by hand. So on the left is me drawing them manually, and on the right is me starting one off, and then we have a process that runs overnight, which uses a combination of Python and SQL to draw them perfectly every time. I'm not saying SQL is the only way of doing this. You probably can do it all in Python, but I've got a bit more knowledge in SQL, so we choose to do some of it in Python, push it to SQL, and then pull it back into ArcGIS Pro to finish off the job. So how that works behind the scenes, we have the first part here, which calculates the geometry. So the initial line you saw me start to draw on the right hand side, that basically gives it the bearing, the start X and the start Y, and then that goes over to SQL, where we do some various trigonometry things, which did take a bit of head scratching, but we got there in the end. Had to go back to some some GCSE trigonometry, which is always fun. And yeah, so this draws the first part. So this draws the up part of the T, and then this draws the crossbar of the T. And then finally we bring it back into Python, which draws the draws the 2 lines in ArcGIS Pro. So that gives us our T. Another example. Oh, so sorry, this is the end result. So obviously that's what I started with, and then overnight this is what it ends with. So yeah, nice and easy. So the final example on this bit is the naming of some of our grounds maintenance contract maps. So this one is a particularly complicated example with lots of roads. For obvious reasons, I don't particularly want to name that because it's going to go all kinds of wrong. But we know the extent of our grounds maintenance contract area. We know what properties fall within that. That's the little black points you can see. So with a quick spatial join, we can establish those relationships. So Python does the spatial join. The result of that gets passed into SQL, where we find the road that appears most frequently. So that becomes sort of the title of that contract map. And then all the other roads get listed alphabetically after that. That then gets fed back into SQL, fed back into the Python script and into ArcGIS Pro, where our attribute tables are updated. And that forms part of the contract map. So that covers off some of the sort of way we automate some of our processes. And now I'm going to talk a bit about our BIM integration. So BIM stands for Building Information Modeling. This is captured and created by our CAD and BIM team, which sit alongside me. This forms part of the Building Safety Act sort of golden thread work. The reasons we do it internally is it saves us quite a bit of money from building sort of or fire safety drawings. It gives us consistency in the models that are produced, and often the results are delivered in a much timelier manner. So what happens is our CAD BIM team, they go out with our Trimble X7, which you can see in the top left. This creates a point cloud, which is what you can see in the bottom right. And from that point cloud, they can use their 3D modeling software, Revit, to create a model, something along the lines of what you see in the middle. So I'm going to try and do a quick live demo. So hopefully this goes well. So I'm going to start with the model that you saw in the slide just a minute ago. So this is a more simple model that we've got. So you can see that we've overlaid this onto master map. We've extruded the buildings by the master map building height attribute. This gives us a bit more context, and we've also got some of our land ownership information, which you can see in the red hatch. So we can sort of interact with this building, we can spin around it, we can zoom right into things, we can click on things and it will give us the attributes of that wall, and we can also slice through this building. So if we do something a bit like this, we can slice through that building, we can see any part of it, we can click on things, so we can click on that table there, it tells us it's furniture, and various attributes about it, and things like that. So that's a nice simple model. This is one that's been produced internally. The other one that we've got, this is one of our new builds in London. So this is actually a developer produced model, so it's much more detailed. So yeah, you can sort of see the extra levels of detail that have gone into things here. Again, we can do exactly what we did with the other model, so we can click on things, it will give us the attributes and that sort of thing. Again, we can slice through the building. And again, we can click on anything we like in here. So that'll tell us it's a kitchen unit or something along those lines. But yeah, this all helps to create a much more visual representation of our assets. We might know that we've got 300 smoke alarms. Well, we now know exactly where those 300 smoke alarms are because they've all been mapped as part of those models. So we can send people exactly to where we need them to go and things like that. So that's it from me. Thanks for everyone for listening. I'll hand back to Izzy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Luke. So it's always great hearing how customers use ArcGIS in their organisations, and you do some really smart connecting work. There we go. Really smart connecting work to let GIS be fully connected into that. And letting all that automation do all the manual lifting for you as well is really, really smart. And also great to see your building models, which is another reason why data in that golden thread is important. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, where we learned about both the importance of data in social housing, but also how GIS can be the window into that data, identifying meaningful insight and informing decision making. And I really enjoyed listening to all our speakers, so I hope you did too. Just one final reminder that the Slido is still open if you do have any questions, and we will follow up after the webinar with any of the questions asked and the answers to those, along with any links that our speakers have talked about. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our new story map. It's called Building Foundations, where we discuss the use cases for GIS alongside the Ordnance Survey's powerful geospatial data in social housing, looking at each use case with the help of an example set by one of our customers. So we'll include a link to the story map in our follow-up email. And if you have a look at it and would like to discuss anything you see there or have heard on the webinar in more detail, then please do reach out. We also have a number of events coming up at the back end of this year, giving you a chance to network and hear from others working in the GIS space. And so look out for registration pages for these on our websites and via emails. But all that leaves me to say is thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.